And then he left and I was back to setting her features all alone in the morgue. The casket lid opened. "We'll figure something out." I heard Alan's footsteps behind me quickly approaching. And then I slid her into the cabinet. That didn't come up with much though. I gave him a thumbs up. I stood there, my head spinning. Seriously? What's wrong with her? Well, nothing to my knowledge. And so I decided to take matters into my own hands. Not knowing what else to do, I called my boss in. Her dark eyes twinkled and her lips were stretched taut into that horrible grin. Whatever this all was, it would be gone and over with by 11 a.m. tomorrow. Ben was already in there working on something else. The phone rang. Set her features like normal, I guess. EW. About a dozen caskets and coffins stood before me of every shape and size. Unless. The flames whooshed on. I need to get out of here now. I don't know when it started exactly. So the smile happened after she had died. She had a little yippee dog that she would walk all the time. Wasn't there some outbreak of something in Siberia several years back? Who was to say that there weren't pathogens under the ground too? Laying in wait, dormant, until somebody dug them up. I desperately wanted to get out of the car and take a closer look, but I knew that would be a really bad idea. Ben and I looked at each other, eyes wide. I grabbed it and pointed one leg of it at her mouth. I bought new adhesive, by the way. For the past 2 years, I've been working as a funeral director, too, at a funeral home in the small town of Sunshine Bay, California too. I chose a nice and natural peach-colored lipstick and applied it to her lips. Usually cheeks are soft, with the cheekbones and jawbones giving them structure. Her expression was perfectly peaceful. No, this was the only delivery that we were waiting for. I left John on the table and I ran to the bathroom. I made a sharp right into the morgue and then called Alan to let him know. Before loading the body into the cabinet, I always did a quick check. She claimed that they had found metal scraps at the construction site too, burned and twisted. Yeah. Did any of the construction workers die? I frowned. First, even if the man was dead, there could still be a parasite alive inside him. There was some bad thunder earlier. Yeah, well, another sigh. Like a lot of the smiling bodies, they're from people who had died of cancer. Sometimes we even turn their lips up a little to make their faces seem more familiar, more alive, instead of the cold mask of death. Maybe that would stop the smile from reappearing. There was no way she was alive, but there was no way she could be grinning like this, dead. Everything was still, silent. As for the creature that was living inside of her, there was no sign of it, or so they said. I didn't remember her name as Ben had been in charge of her. Her file says that she was 160 pounds when she died, he said, but she feels really light to me. I grabbed her by the shoulders and shifted her on the table a little. Yeah, I replied. She does feel a little bit light. The ones that had already been buried were exhumed. Something felt different. I poked and prodded her cheeks, frowning. And then I left the room to grab the pair of earrings that the family had left for her. She even invited me over for tea one time when I was locked out of my apartment. And then it was over. I stepped back and gave her a final look. My heart dropped when I saw that all of them came from Everson Delivery Services. I sat by the window waiting, watching the rain pound on the glass. How did an entire skeleton burn up so fast? I spent the rest of the day sneaking away on my phone researching, but everything seemed to reach a dead end. I raked through the entire 10-page forum thread where the woman had talked about the body found at the construction site, but my faith in her story started to flag. The footsteps were getting progressively louder. Sheriff Thompson told us that it was a parasite, something in the water highly contagious. Areas of clear water were cordoned off for decontamination. We don't want any studies conducted, nothing of the sort, okay? You can't make us stop, Alan told him. Her lips were pressed tightly together, covering her teeth, and the corners of her mouth sharply curved upwards. An expression like that wouldn't just require you to move your facial muscles. I used it double the number of stitches. The man's bones that burned up too fast in the crematory. And the smiles that kept reappearing over and over. It took me many hours of internet sleuthing to find out any information, but I finally did. I stumbled towards the road, glancing back a final time. Mildred wasn't following. As I flipped through the man's files, however, I felt a rush of relief. Alan and I gave each other a look, and then we rolled the body off to the cremator. I think they only broke ground in the last 2 houses recently. Besides, maybe it has a dormant phase or something. Because, despite all my work on Amber Eye's face, her smile had reappeared. We had gotten an irate call from her sister at the funeral. There were police reports too from the car accident and the mugging, but none of those mentioned a smile. Everson Delivery Services probably went out of business. So that's what I did. Do you like lawsuits? Because if there's a news story on WBX about smiling corpses, you better believe the families affected are going to be looking for someone to blame, and that someone is going to be you. It was 1 or 2 of them. Could be some plastic surgery. He was considerably younger than me and Alan, only 21, and heavily influenced by social media. I called Alan back over. I have to hide. Decomposition can also make the body move. I had read an article about a man whose arms had stretched straight out at his sides weeks after death because of decomposition. But then we started getting more and more of them, and everything began to spiral out of control. But I couldn't sit there and keep watching it. Maybe real human bodies are too full of bones and organs and blood to inhabit, so they built a replica based on the corpses of those who have died. Speaking of the bodies, the police never found where all the real dead bodies went, and the other 30 smiling corpses were sent to a lab for examination. 3 weeks ago, I think, although time has been passing strangely since it all began. When it started, of course, not all the bodies were smiling. I noticed one of the stitches had snapped, a piece of clear thread trailed out of her mouth. Standing in the dark hallway, silhouetted by the glass door behind her, was the naked figure of Mildred Hastings. Alan averted his eyes. Understood, he finally muttered quietly, good. That thing must have died from whatever the pathogen was. And when it was dug up, it infected someone. And then I was done. I stumbled out of the morgue and into Alan's office. I held my breath as he hit play. I watched the screen as I worked on Amber's body, and the grainy and black and white footage. Her skin was so cold. If they're not, you can leave then. Alan. The floor spun underneath me. Mildred had made it to the top of the stairs. It couldn't be Ben playing with us, could it? I asked. Just give me some time to think about it, okay? A few days. I tried to not even look at his face, just focusing on getting him ready, like it was as mundane as sweeping the floor or folding clothes. Oh shit. He glanced back at me, obviously confused. Oh, cool, I rolled my eyes. Her skin was as white as marble. I guess to Ben, the allure of making a viral TikTok outweighed the chances of ruining his entire career. Ben laughed, looking dejected. Nothing made sense. I froze. For several seconds, he didn't say anything. Amber Reese was smiling again. The shrill sound of the ringing pierced the silence. That's all that I had to do. Then I would be on my way home to snuggling up in a blanket and watching TV. Name 5 things you can see, I told myself. He had bought it from the Moiner several years back, and he had turned it from a small operation to one of the biggest funeral homes in the county. He didn't want a scandal or lawsuits more than anyone, so he shut up. I stitched her mouth shut, and she's grinning again. Clearly it's not killing people because all of them had a legitimate cause of death. Highview Lane was within a wealthy neighborhood, a development of McMansions that had been built last year. Mildred Hastings. "I've never seen anything like this," he said finally. I joined him at her side, looked down at her awful smiling face. Within the fenced-in area, I saw 2 large rectangular holes. The basements had been dug out already, the foundations ready to be poured, but the developer had abandoned them. The soil was rough and dark rather than smooth and crusted over. Just an animal, I told myself. He pulled the lever. Every fiber of me was screaming, "Get out! Get out now!" I turned on my heel and I ran down the hallway, sprinting towards the back door. I stopped dead in my tracks. I unzipped the bag all the way and pressed my hands inside, as if a 180-pound woman could be hiding somewhere inside it. Really weird. Usually, the people handling the delivery always roll the body into the morgue for us, common courtesy in the funeral home world, but I had spooked them with my questions about Elias. I listened to lots of audiobooks, my boss is great, and I don't mind being around the deceased, too. But then, as my hands worked, I had a moment of clarity. Last time, maybe I needed to set her features in the complete opposite direction. I'm sure the family would be pissed to see her frowning at the funeral, but I didn't care. But even if he made them smile, the smile would fade before they got here, I pointed out. That kind of smile with her lips covering her teeth like that, it requires the muscles to stay flexed. I had to look inside his mouth and make sure that there weren't any squiggling, writhing leeches in there. So even though I wasn't particularly fond of Ben, I gently led him back to the morgue and showed him the records. No, they were full-on grins, stretching dead skin to the corners of their mouths. They were grotesque. Her dark eyes glinted. We usually leave the bodies in the cremator for 2 to 3 hours, because while the soft tissue gets reduced to ash pretty fast, the bones take hours to fully carbonize. The remains that we pulled out should have been a skeleton. Examination. The first several bodies, including Amber's, had come from Highview Lane. Thump. Her name was Amber Reese and she was 31 years old, much younger than the bodies that I usually worked with. She had died of a sudden blood clot. As much as I liked my job, I hated dealing with the younger ones. Before I even unzipped the body bag, I was imagining the small children that she may have left behind, the aging parents grieving their daughter, the friends and family mourning a life gone too soon. I extinguished the thoughts and got to work. I snapped at him. "I'm coming," I muttered under my breath, my legs wobbly beneath me. I picked it up in the third ring. "Hello, is this Moyner Funeral Home?" The voice on the other end of the line asked. "Yes, hi, this is Dan with Meadows Services. I'm calling to schedule the delivery of Mildred Hastings." I frowned. He had been working on another smithing body. It appeared to have just been a shell completely hollowed out on the inside. "What do you mean schedule it? She was delivered a few minutes ago." "But she's smiling." To be clear, yes, I know that sometimes the deceased appear to be smiling slightly. Sometimes their facial features are built that way, sort of a resting happy face. Sounds good. Do you happen to have Elias' phone number by any chance? The two men traded a look. It didn't make sense. And then the delivery arrived. A sleek, dark van rolling into the driveway. "No. I know. Huh." I was always able to disassociate it from the person who lived in it. Mildred's footsteps coming up the stairs. A creeping dread trickled down my back. I stared at the computer screen, stunned. I remember last year, our car had gotten into an accident while transporting a body and it had gotten a little damaged. A really long, thin body and bluish-white skin, like a cave creature or something. She'd have to be rail thin to be 97 pounds, if she could even get to that weight at all. Ben told me that he would discuss it with Alan and then continued preparing her for burial. Mildred's body was gone. She lunged at me. I burst onto the first floor, ran to the front door, twisted the knob. For some reason, not many people in Clearwater chose to be cremated. Whenever one did, Ben got excited. The creature didn't infect people with a parasite. Her eyes were closed and her lips were blue. It was completely and totally empty. I rolled the body down the hallway myself, the metal wheels clattering against the floor. There was really only one explanation that suddenly hit me like a ton of bricks. I ran over, hardly believing it. As soon as I was in total darkness, I pulled out my phone and dialed a 911. Thunder rumbled behind me, rattling the glass. Great. Vanderbilt ready, but we can check the security footage. Alan had installed security cameras in every room of the funeral home after someone had broken in over the summer. What did you do to this one? Nothing, she came like that. Like our very own Montauk monster. Each time that I saw that grin yank up again, I felt like I might vomit. I froze. We had received a total of 27 so far. I suddenly had the mental image of a pale leech-like creature slithering around in John's mouth, stretching his lips into that hideous smile. I went back to working on John. I poked and prodded some more, but that only confused me further. Something just felt off about the way that her bones and facial muscles were all fitting together just underneath the skin. I drove down to that area of town myself to see if there was something, anything that I could figure out. I wouldn't get out of the car in case there was something in the air, a virus, a pathogen, fungal spores, but I would drive around and see if anything struck me. I ran down the hallway and wrenched at one of the windows, but I was 2 stories up. Maybe you're getting her confused with another delivery. I think the power is out in a few places, though. Does her face feel weird to you? He poked and prodded at her face as well, frowning. Hey, can I ask you something? You work for Elias, right? Hey, can I ask you something? You work for Elias, right? His smile instantly dropped. We've been getting some bodies that have been smiling. We just couldn't keep this a secret. I heard Mildred's footsteps enter the room. Every muscle in my body froze. My breathing sounded incredibly loud, like it was being piped through a surround sound stereo, and so I held my breath, but even my heartbeat, the rush of blood through my veins, sounded incredibly loud, locked in this casket. Thump. When he came back, his expression was grim. I got out a piece of paper and wrote down everything that I knew so far. The convergence of cases on Highview Lane, the weird construction site, the smiling bodies which had other abnormalities, not bruising, weighing less than they should and burning up faster. After that I wrote down everyone involved: the police, Sheriff Thompson, the coroner Jack, the delivery companies, and the 3 of us, Alan, Ben, and me. Several more searches only produced one interesting fact that was probably more of a coincidence than anything else. The man who led one of the delivery companies was named Elias. The guy who worked on the construction site at Highview Lane mentioned in the forum post was also named Elias. A spark of an idea lit within me. Could Elias be a spark of an idea lit within me? Yeah, a little bit, he said finally, but not abnormally. What do I do? The footsteps got louder. Even though I told myself that, I hit the gas and sped home as fast as I could. But the more that I worked, the more time I spent with her alone in this room, the more panicked I became. Suddenly I felt dizzy. Alan had stopped investigating and just continued buying more and more of the adhesive by the gallon jug, but I was getting really concerned at this point, so I continued to investigate on my own untraceable anonymous stuff so that Alan wouldn't be getting mad at me. Internet sleuthing and the like. All my investigations into their desk came up as dead ends, and so I turned to their lives. It would require you to hold them like that. I'm done. Please, I whispered, my words muffled in the soft, puffy cotton sides of the casket. Please help me. Then again, he was dressed. Alan left and then it was just me, alone in the funeral home. Without a word, he walked into the room, looking over to her. Something awful was happening here and it was spreading. The taller man replied, shaking his head. The next theory was that the coroner was doing it, before the bodies got to us. The funeral home is on a hill and the back door is on the basement level with the morgue. Alan thought that it was so convenient, but I thought it was a nuisance, going up and down the stairs all the time. Alan stood there frozen, his mouth hanging open, his brown skin ashen. The first one came on a cold, rainy day. I stumbled over to the wall and leaned against it, trying not to fall. I set her features, I told him. 3 weeks had passed since the first corpse had arrived. What should I do with her? I asked Alan. Sometimes I wonder if they actually captured it and took it off to some secret government compound for examination. Captured it, and took it off to some secret government compound for examination. If I touched their faces, was I now infected? Panic set in. My mouth felt itchy or stiff or something. I quickly unzipped the rest of the bag, but she was definitely dead. I sighed, shaking my head. She would talk to me when I got my mail. And so I inched the car forward until my tires bumped the curb, and then I flicked down the high beams. Without a doubt, working here was the best job that I had ever had, until we started getting the smiling corpses. Alan had locked up when he left. I know. That's impossible, I said, my voice wavering. And so we rolled her onto the scale. When the number came up, my heart dropped. As soon as Mildred took a jerky, stumbling step forward, I thrust the leg into her open mouth. And in a human screech filled the room. Sheriff Thompson replied, cutting him off. I sat down in Alan's chair before I had the chance to faint. All I had to do was set her face again, load her into one of the refrigerated cabinets, and my job was done. The site had clearly been prepared for building. I had forgotten to do it once, and it was the only time that Alan yelled at me, but as I worked on the stitches, I couldn't stop picturing Amber's grin, and I felt like there was more resistance from her lips than there should have been, or was I imagining it? The needle slipped against my fingers, but I forced myself to keep going even though my heartbeat was ratcheting up again. I ran a comb through her dyed blonde hair, arranging it with my hands. It was pure darkness, like I was buried in the earth itself. One of the professors at Hawthorne wants to. Can you stay? I guess so. Did Ben already leave? Yeah, he got out 10 minutes early, Alan said with a sigh. This day was just getting worse and worse by the minute. Rigor mortis takes hours. If she had died smiling, her face would naturally relax into a neutral setting before everything went stiff. The bodies had never bothered me like this. That was the delivery company that Elias ran. Because Alan and I kept one of the smiling corpses, the family had asked that he be cremated, and we gave them fake ashes instead. What the hell? The 3 most recent ones had come from only a half-mile away from the funeral home. I hurried downstairs. Let's weigh her again, I said. Could Elias be patient's hero? Hard at work, I see, Alan said when he found me sitting in the morgue staring at my phone. Oh, sorry, I said hastily, just taking a quick break. I whipped around and ran. Everything's fine. Alan ordered some sort of industrial-strength adhesive, and when we used that on the lips instead of the thread, it seemed that the smiles didn't come back. And so for weeks, that's how we dealt with one of the most horrific things to happen in Sunshine Bay, California too. Alan buried his face in his hands and let out a groan. If we tell everyone, there's gonna be a panic and I might go out of business. Unfortunately, he seemed to take me less seriously than before, his eyebrows raising higher and higher as I told him everything. When I opened the door, I found Ben standing over Amber's corpse. Whoa, he said as I walked in. For a second, I was paralyzed, and then I pulled my knees up to my chest and I kicked her as hard as I could. I nodded. He yanked the lever down, but it was too late. Alan started calling colleagues of his, even professors at the local college, but none of them knew. He started floating various theories, and maybe the coroner was using contaminated tools or substances that the body was having a post-mortem allergic reaction to. I have to. The door clanked to shut and Ben adjusted the settings and then looked at me. My gaze caught on one of the enormous easels. So, you think the construction workers dug up this monster, and then it spread some disease to them somehow? He could have easily said the bump on her head was there when the body had arrived, or tried to cover it with her hair and hope that they didn't notice. I was losing my balance. "She looks really creepy," he said with a grin, and then I saw his hand twitch towards his pocket, towards his phone. I stared down at him, my entire world tunneling down into a single focal point. His mouth. On the drive over from the corner. My legs felt weak underneath me. John Ivanov, the mugging victim with no bruises. There was no way that he could still be alive. And then the two men hurried back into the van. I could tell that it really bothered him, but the Moyner funeral home was his pride and joy. We glued a corpse's mouth shut. I left his office disturbed. Alan always did the right thing, even when it meant that his business was suffering. It seemed certain. A few days later, we got a visit from the sheriff. We didn't make the delivery today because of the storm. She was right there. I unzipped the body bag. I don't think so. Maybe that was my problem. "You're not supposed to be looking into this," he said angrily, although I had a feeling that his anger was more about Sheriff Thompson than me. But when I unzipped her, I froze. But he had told them the truth, that we didn't package the body correctly and that there was an accident. He sat down at the desk and pulled up the security footage. I worked on autopilot. I yanked the corners of his mouth down into a deep frown, and then I grabbed the clear thread and, steadying my shaking hands, plunged the needle into his lips. I've never come across anything like this. As soon as the door shut, relief flooded over me. I kept the heat off, not to let any sort of pathogen into the car, and I continued driving. It was only 9 o'clock, but everything appeared closed. "Listen, we have a delivery on the way, but I gotta get heading home." I couldn't get enough oxygen. Cabinets, hand sanitizers, scissors, linens, and Amber Reese's dead body. This grounding technique wasn't quite as effective when I was in the morgue room. 97 pounds. Maybe the coroner entered the wrong weight. It's attracting too much attention. The corners of Amber's mouth yanked up. Jay's got a fever and stuff. I know. But this time it was different. Her skin hung loose on her body, her bare feet sticking to the linoleum floor beneath her. And she was smiling. I should have hidden a doorway or under the stairs so I could keep running, keep changing hiding spots. I always sucked at hide and seek. My heart pounded as I realized the text on the door read, "Everson Delivery Services." And then I pulled the heavy lid back over me, lowering it as gently as I could so that it wouldn't thunk shut. "No, it's fine. That's not possible." The street and sidewalk listened red, reflecting the myriad of taillights from all the braking cars. I saw a couple hurry past, angling their umbrella in front of them to try and block the rain. With Ben relieved, he excused himself for an early lunch break. I sat there alone in the morgue, phone in hand, swiveling gently in the chair. Why? This development had been in high demand. I began to panic. Maybe she had some sort of deformity, and this is her natural expression. I don't think so. For a split second, I thought about going back downstairs, but then I heard it. I grabbed my phone and turned the flashlight on. Hand shaking, I lifted it over his mouth and peered in. As soon as he was gone, I forced myself to re-sew her mouth shut, and then I pushed the corners of her mouth down hard until she looked like she was frowning. I put the final touches on her face, poking and prodding here and there. He looked just as confused as I was. The old woman that lived 2 floors down from me. I saw her all the time. I shone the flashlight all around, even lifting his lips to look at his gums and teeth, but I didn't see anything. I dropped the easel and I ran down the stairs. I had read that climate change was causing ice to melt in the Arctic, and it was releasing pathogens. The grotesque grin pushing my fingers hard into her flesh, forcing her mouth to turn down. Oh, well, it was true that I had spent a good part of the workday on my phone. Smiling that horrible, stretched grin. Did you know they found this really weird dead animal where they were building those big houses by Johnson Park? My husband's cousin works on the construction team. He said when they were excavating, they found this dead animal, except it looked like nothing that he had ever seen. Maybe it's in the town's water supply. I stared down at her, slightly taller than average with an average physique. Reluctantly, I walked out of his office and headed back to the morgue. But right now, we've got to get back into work. A few bodies arrived today and one of them is smiling. Have you seen them? Nope, haven't seen anything like that. I jumped about a foot in the air, swearing. 1 second passed, 2, and then it happened. Call me back if there's anything else weird. And then he turned on his heel and walked away. The dirt wall of the left hole looked disturbed. What the hell? No, there must be a mistake. We just got her. We don't want people, outsiders poking around in our business, you know. With all due respect, Alan replied, seems like this kind of thing has never been documented before. I mean, I suppose everything you're saying could be true. The realization came crashing down on me. But I know the truth. And this wasn't a random twitch either. But there was something else bothering me too. I stared up at the houses. Of course, when I got back to the morgue, John was grinning again. They didn't want me to know anything about him. I got the message that this was the end of the conversation loud and clear. I stared down at John's pale face, his stubble-lined lips twisted into a smile. I could turn around in a driveway, but I felt like that could provoke someone. My headlights would be shining right in their windows. The cul-de-sac was only about 10 yards ahead of me anyway. When I got to the cul-de-sac, however, I froze. There were no houses here. Instead, the entire area had been cordoned off with chain-link fences. A sign hung from the metal reading in big red letters, "Keep out." I couldn't breathe. Her white hair fell in messy, scraggly curls over her face. Do what exactly? Tell the police? Like Sheriff Thompson would actually help us, he scoffed. And it doesn't seem like it's actually harming anyone. Yeah, but wasn't this last year? We would have been getting smiling bodies for months, and then, if what you're saying is true, most parasites were uninterested in bones. On page 3, she linked to her blog post, which was filled with obnoxious ads and talks about aliens. I reached into the body bag and pulled out her bony wrist, checking for a pulse. If I wasn't looking right at her, I would have guessed this woman was no more than 100 pounds. I could feel the heaviness of her presence weighing down on the hot air of the casket itself, pressing down on me, smothering me. Smothering me. You had to do this, otherwise their mouth would loll open and look weird. Should I turn it off? Ben replied, his face white. The floor spun underneath me. So what? We just keep it a secret, I asked. Our very own Roswell incident. Instead, they were just a pile of ash. Alan didn't know what to say to that, and so he excused himself to call the coroner. I know. Then all I could do was wait. We usually didn't get pedestrians here, even though we were just off Main Street. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe he thought that he was helping us, making the bodies look a little less dead. Don't even think about taking a picture. The bones burned up when they shouldn't have. Alan rewound the footage, playing the footage over and over again, muttering to himself about rigor mortis and other medical jargon. I wished it was. I continued in a hushed tone. I positioned my index and middle fingers over the corners of her mouth, and in one swift motion I pushed down. Of course, this didn't explain why the bodies started smiling again even after we had set their features, but we were grasping at straws. No one had a possible explanation for what was going on. I needed to calm down. Creak. And then we heard it. A faint, high-pitched screech joined the pops and crackles of the fire, almost like the shrill sound of a whistle except more human. Why am I hiding here? If she finds me, I have no escape. A few random posts on local websites claimed the building sites had been abandoned because the soil had too much clay in it, or the rock underneath wasn't structurally sound. But there was one post on a local forum last year that I would have easily dismissed as a conspiracy theory if I hadn't been dealing with smiling dead bodies on a day-to-day basis. That a ghost was holding up the corners of her mouth. "There's no way this woman is 97 pounds, I said. In other words, it was spreading. The nexus was Highview Lane, with the smiling corpses spreading outwards towards the rest of the town, like some sort of virus. We continued to receive more smiling corpses. We stayed quiet about it though. I told Alan everything that I found. Something was bothering me, though I didn't want to tell Ben. I grabbed her by her midsection and shook her a little more. This time his tone sounded more sincere. Maybe she had had work done, like fillers or Botox, I thought. I turned on the light, rolled the steel bed a little closer to me and reached for the body bag zipper. I stepped away from the body, forced myself to take a deep breath. I actually love it here. Alan sighed. Jasmine Thomas, 47, pronounced dead at the scene of a car accident. Eleanor Wu, 62, dead after a long battle with pancreatic cancer. John Ivanov, 23, dead from a mugging gone wrong. All smiling. Alan and I called the police, the coroner, the delivery people. But nobody reported seeing the bodies smiling. Mildred's face loomed over me. The most recent ones, however, had come from the areas furthest from that street. He let out a sigh. The remains had already been reduced to lumps of charred ash. Yeah, it's fine, I told him, and then I hugged up the phone. Black dots danced in my vision. Stop scaring yourself. Thunder rumbled in the distance, cut with the sound of distant sirens. I scrambled out of the casket, the heavy lid scraping along my back, almost pinning me down. But I made my way out, fighting for my life until I fell onto the floor. Sorry, I said again. The body bag was zipped all the way down, and it was empty. No, no, no. But these bodies weren't smiling slightly. She was smiling. There didn't seem to be a common thread. Ben loved the cremator. But her cheeks felt firm all over, like they had their own internal structure somehow. He's supposed to be cremated, I told Ben. And then her mouth opened. What is it with some people in fire? We rolled the body down to the cremator and got the man inside. Twitching is common, caused by the release of chemicals left over in nerve endings. Ben had done that earlier, so it was very possible that all those wounds were covered up by clothing. Could things like leeches and tapeworms make noise? A quick search told me yes. There was a 3-centimeter marine worm that lived off the coast of Japan, for example, that could make loud popping sounds. It was like they were attached to a fishing line that had suddenly been pulled taut. What the hell? Alan said. Oh, great, thanks, I replied, rolling my eyes. I closed his mouth and then I forced myself to take a few deep breaths, slowly letting them out. I ran into the morgue and I froze. Extra strength. I wonder if he's really Elias at all, or if he's simply a meat suit, a shell, controlled by one of those alien creatures. Because a few weeks later, I read an article about a missing woman showing up at her husband's doorstep, alive and well. Please. But I knew that that was impossible. As soon as I put them in, I'd be done, and I would never have to look at this woman ever again. I grabbed them from the office and then hurried back to the morgue. I followed him down the hallway, feeling a little bit better with each step that I put between myself and Amber Reese. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my entire body shaking. That included locking the front door with the deadbolt. That only he had the key to. They're quiet and they're not trying to sell me something, which is a lot more than I can say for most of the living. I also feel like preparing the bodies for burial is an act of respect, a service to the community, something that gives my life meaning. I swirled a brush into pressed powder and swept it across her cheeks, her forehead and her nose. No. Her face just does that and we don't know why. However, the smiling victims were of every age, gender, occupation, ethnicity, and religion. Maybe they were being stored at a slight incline, and that was moving the facial muscles. Mildred staggered back. Well, shit. We made a few more phone calls to police officers, medical examiners, even a few EMTs, but nobody knew what we were talking about, and the body had been securely locked away after the autopsy according to the coroner. I made it to the back door and I burst through it, out into the storm. I let out the breath that I had been holding. For a split second, I thought that I saw a flicker of movement in the darkness of his throat. She's in the morgue right now. I don't know what's going on, okay, and neither does Alan. She looks like she's grinning, and when I set her face she went back to grinning. He sat with us at Alan's office, arms crossed, giving each of us an icy glare. I'm going to have to ask you to stop investigating this, he told us plainly. We lost half of the funeral expenses, but Alan believed in doing the right thing. Or so I thought. When the police broke into the building, they found Mildred's eviscerated body. Anyway, I'll lock up and everything. Something deep inside of me snapped. I was on the verge of a panic attack. 5 smiling corpses had come in now. If it were just one, or even maybe 2, it could be explained away as an allergic reaction or a deformity or whatever Alan's theory of the day was. Beyond his teeth in the darkness of his throat, I could see a pale face, eyes closed as if it were sleeping. In, out, in, out. No. It's all over. The husband was reporting strange behavior, and I wondered if she too was just a shell. All the bodies had started smiling after they had died, which didn't make a lick of sense. What do you mean? We have her body right here. The fall could kill me, especially since it wasn't grass beneath but hard pavement. I swallowed. I had never had a panic attack here before. Hands shaking, I leaned over the man's face and pulled his mouth open. Her mouth opened wider and wider until her jaw unhinged completely. But it sounds extremely far-fetched. Honestly, I had done a pretty good job. Something was infecting them. Maybe some sort of parasite or a bacteria. Left and then it was just me, alone in the funeral home. But this wasn't decomposition, because she had been presumably stored properly since her death. Holding my breath, I pushed my fingers into his mouth and yanked his jaw open. Within her throat I could see 2 glittering black eyes and the pale bluish flesh of a creature who had never seen the sun. Just like the creature they found on Highview Lane, I thought dimly. So good luck with that. Dead bodies move after death on occasion. I took a few more minutes to collect myself, taking in deep and calming breaths, and then I forced myself to continue working. I walked over to the cabinet, got out the clear thread, and started to sew her mouth shut. All you need to worry about is getting the body in. We started getting more and more of them and everything began to spiral out of control. He glanced up at me and grinned. Left the smiling one for you, he said. No, there's no way that that can happen. It wasn't a gray area, it was black and white. I rolled the car forward to get a better look. There wasn't any. He didn't look happy. Can you just tell me if tomorrow afternoon is okay, ma'am? The voice said on the other line. And then something even worse occurred to me. They quickly pulled out, sloshing rain everywhere, leaving me alone with the body. Patient 0. That can't happen, can it? I asked, my voice shaking. An older woman in her 50s or 60s. Hey Sam, can you come here for a second? Ben asked from the other side of the morgue. Nothing was there. They glinted in the dim light, polished to perfection, alongside arrangements of fake flowers and easels displaying portraits of random people. I picked one at random, a heavy mahogany casket engraved with a cross, and I climbed in. Get a grip. And with that, the sheriff was gone. There's no chance that he was actually alive, right? Ben asked. No. She didn't say anything about it, but like you said, the pathogen doesn't kill people. And if they're mad that they have to take the body back to the coroner, then that's their problem. Hey, thanks for waiting, the shorter one said, smiling at me. I shot out of the hallway and into the nearest room, the showroom. The woman who weighed 97 pounds. Thump. I pondered all of this as I pulled on my rubber gloves and started working on John Ivanov. Ben was right. And then the footsteps stopped. Thump. I'll think on it, I promise. Thank you. So what? The thing is causing cancer. Alan? I shouted. With all my being, I wished that this was some ridiculous prank, and not the body moving on its own. Ben was the other mortician. Sheriff Thompson replied. All I needed to do was zip her up, get her in the cabinet, and leave. Jack said that she wasn't smiling when he was doing the autopsy. Dread flooded me like somebody had just dumped a bucket of ice water over me. She seemed to have found the casket that I was in. When I finally got to the back door, the two men were already rolling the body out of the back. Sure. I leaned against the cabinet and held myself steady, a wave of nausea rolling through me. Neon signs for gas stations and convenience stores glowing brightly in the darkness. She stood perfectly still. A pause. Great. I printed out a map of Clearwater and in red pen made a little dot where each of the smiling ones had lived. Well, that was weird. Sometimes they got a little jostled in transit, and I wouldn't want to store the body with their face tilted to the side, for example. The man had died several days ago and had been stored in a refrigerated cabinet. Idiot. That was it. I left the office and hurried back to the morgue. I wanted Amber Reese gone, and she would be tomorrow morning when we drove her to the cemetery. Donator, slightly taller than average with an average physique. A heavy silence filled the room. A torrent of rain fell onto me, soaking me. Anyway, they should be here by 6. The next bunch had come from the street surrounding it. They formed a cluster on the west side of town, with several of them coming from the same street, Highview Lane, the street bordering the woods of the state park. I uncapped the red pen and wrote the date above each dot, not necessarily their death date but the date that we had received the body from our internal records, and that's when I came to a horrifying conclusion. The ones that had already been buried were exhumed. Now if I weren't a funeral director, too, I'd be thinking, no big deal, she died smiling, and rigor mortis set in. It was nauseating. I'll pay you overtime, of course, too. What? Why? Alan asked. Mildred was dead, and she was smiling. The same smile that all of them had, except this time it was twisting features that were familiar to me, a face that I knew. Of course, the creature in there didn't understand. Little did I know that Amber Reese was just the beginning. For the first time, he looked utterly panicked. I watched as I left to get the earrings. I forced my breathing to slow. Please don't find me. They seemed to have absolutely nothing in common. Until I looked up their addresses. My fingers worked over her cold skin quickly, trying to get the whole thing over with as fast as possible. Calm down. I re-sewed his mouth shut, even though I knew that it was probably futile. My entire body was shaking with tension and I needed something to keep busy as I worked. Though, I noticed something else odd. Hadn't John died and a mugging gone wrong? Hadn't he been stabbed? Yet his pale skin was as perfect as porcelain. No purple bruises, no stab wounds as far as I could see. It was a grin. I had driven past this area of town while they were building it, and the starting price of the homes had shot up more than 50% between breaking ground and finishing the last house. So if the demand was there and there was money to be made, why did they just stop? Maybe they found something. I thought maybe they dug up something. Maybe they dug up a parasite or a virus or some other kind of pathogen. I loaded him into the cabinet, desperate not to look at him anymore. I don't know, but this isn't a coincidence. Of course, if it were infectious, it was probably too late, but I had to do something. The stitches had snapped and a single drop of blood coated his lips. Probably a raccoon or something that fell down there and was scrambling to get out. He was always filming something or talking about some sort of TikTok challenge that he had done. Yeah, that's what I thought. Highview Lane was evacuated. It was her body. What the hell? Maybe she was somehow alive. With my hands shaking, I gently touched her lips and then her cheeks. I can't, he agreed. But let me ask you this, Alan. I ran out of the office, heart pounding in my ears. I recognized her. I explained all of this to Alan in his office, in an ear whisper with the doors closed. It's spreading, I said, pointing to the map. I don't know, I honestly don't. People didn't like being reminded of their own mortality. Who else had access to the body? He shook his head. The next week, we got more smiling corpses. I followed him over. No. Sure, the grass was long but there weren't any trees, and the area was unnaturally flat. I was always able to convince myself it was just a dead flesh, just something left behind. No different than the strands of hair and dead skin that we leave behind when we're alive. He's supposed to be getting Mr. What is that? I asked. It looked like nobody had tampered with the body, so maybe it was just something about Amber, something congenital, some sort of disease or something that her mouth had turned up in a smile several hours after death. I knew it made no sense, but what else was I supposed to tell myself? That some demon had possessed her dead body and made it smile. I held my breath, my entire body shaking. Don't get any closer, I shouted. As the woman glanced up at her sign, she scrunched her face in disgust. I gave the woman on the other line the address. I had read somewhere in some inspirational article somewhere that it only took 12 muscles to smile, and many more to frown. That meant that all 12 of Amber Reese's facial muscles were working in concert, making and holding a smile. No one should have had access to the body except us, the coroner, and the drivers who delivered her. Her skin hung loosely over her skull. Still, I had dealt with a few victims of muggings and other violent crimes in my career, and none of them looked as pristine as John did even when fully dressed. Other than looking deathly blue, he looked as if he were in perfect health, only sleeping. The grin somehow looked even more grotesque on his young face. Hey, maybe that's why she's smiling. I mean, it's possible, I guess, he replied. After pacing the room a few times to calm myself down, I walked back over to the body. They were so sterile and harsh-looking, white with trim and gutters painted black. The wood between the window panes was painted black too, making the house look more like a prison than a home. I'm not sure whether it was the wealth of the place or some sort of sixth sense. An instinctual feeling, but I felt unwelcome, like I was trespassing, like everyone in these houses was watching me, watching the beat-up sedans scutter along their pristine streets. I washed my hands over and over again. Elias Everson skipped town and disappeared off the map completely. But, here you go, he said, cutting me off. But 5? When as far as we knew this had never happened before. She almost looked like she was asleep. All the victims lived within a square mile of each other. My body went cold, my head spun. He was a bit odd, so it wasn't out of the question. It is the parasite. Alan cooled it on the investigation after that. The door swung shut. It made no sense. I got a call from WBX the other day and they want to do a story on it, asking all kinds of questions. I couldn't see anything. I shuddered and I loaded him into the cabinet, desperate not to look at him anymore. I'm onto something. Sorry, can't do that, the shorter one said. Why not? He's a very private person, the taller one said, rolling the cart down the ramp. What if the bodies weren't the real bodies of the deceased? What if someone somewhere along the chain was trading out all the corpses for different ones, clones, replicas, ones that were smiling that kept smiling no matter how many times we set their features? I pulled up our records and typed in a few names of smiling bodies that I remembered, like John Ivanov and Jasmine Thomas. I know that's a horrible thing to do, except it isn't that horrible when you consider the remains weren't even his to begin with. Alan and I set the body on the table in front of us, staring at each other. "You ready?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I am," I replied. Alan sunk a scalpel into the dead man's chest. He peeled back the skin, and when I leaned forward, I almost threw up. The man had no ribs and no organs and nothing that was remarkably human. In their place was a creature with pale bluish skin folded in on itself. And then I drove up the hill and turned onto Highview Lane. My heart plummeted to the floor. I then did a ton of searches whether certain pathogens or parasites could alter bone density. The whole thing about the skeleton not burning up seemed like the only fact that I could cling to. "Look, I'm sorry, okay? But now that I know this, we have to do something."